Oh, welcome back to episode 3 of Best Creepypastas of 2023.
A large box, about 1 foot cubed. It looked like old cardboard, like what happens when it gets soaked but left out to dry. Just dingy. Its sides had been stapled together too, and that gave it a real homemade look that went the extra creepy little mile. I expected something bad. I knew the second when I went to lift it, and it was too heavy, that something was wrong. It just felt like lifting an overfull bucket from the bottom. And then there was the smell, and a noise that sounded like a distant transmission of a mewing child. Tinny, like the muffled cries of someone on the other side of a very thick wall. When I finally opened it, I found the policeman inside. Familiar because of the shield and name. He'd been folded, I guess is the best way I can describe it. At first, I thought it was just his uniform. But, clothes aren't warm, and obviously a folded uniform wouldn't explain the forearm hair and skin poking out the side. I recoiled, terrified, fell backwards onto my ass, and this was when Grenwig made his appearance. His arachnid fingers curled out from the box. I'd say about a dozen of them this time. There are always more in the dark, out of sight, and these did what I couldn't have brought myself to do on my own. They enfolded the policeman, lifted him up like a tailor showing off a suit, and the flayed skin opened up to reveal the barely recognizable outline of an adult man.
Not the gift of
He was
thought.
still alive, and the rest of him, I soon found out, was in my bathtub. And that half was also very much alive, thrashing and sliding as it struggled to gain a grip on the smooth ceramic, begging for its other half. Words I don't really think were a natural fit for the stern man who'd interrogated me just 10 hours ago. But then again, it wasn't really the same man. Either way, he spoke of the darkness between atoms, the infinite space where time doesn't exist, and the endless shapes that swim the murky abyss, fleeing their cruel god. More than that, he lamented no longer being whole, feeling himself in two places at once. He called it wrong, and on that, he had my agreement. I begged Grenwig to take it away, to undo what he had done. And that was how I used my first favor. The box and the man disappeared, dragged off to some dark corner that was out of sight. And that was the last I saw of him. Although a bit of research later on revealed that while Grenwig did indeed put him back together, the poor man has been catatonic in a hospital bed ever since. Alive, but definitely not well.
I bet.
The next day, the kids asked me what I'd requested. I told them I asked for a new PlayStation. Didn't tell them the truth, partially because it would traumatize them, but partially because acknowledging it even happened would traumatize me. After that, I crunched the numbers. I figured out the number of kids and how often the rota would fall on me. Based on this info, I booked the week off ahead of time. And, I just waited. I tried to support the kids as best I could when it was their turn, but they didn't really have the same problems as me. I mean, it wasn't a holiday for them either. Each one came to school looking like they'd spent the night watching their dog die over and over. Just distraught, ruined, exhausted. But like I said, Grenwick generally let them eat their food, interact with their parents and siblings without demanding attention at the worst possible time. Eventually, round 2 came along. The kids seemed damned relieved. As for Grenwick's games, this time I came prepared. I'd already noticed that Grenwick only ever emerged from the shadows, and the kids corroborated that fact. So in the run up to my turn, I spent the week setting up my bathroom with as many lamps and torches as I could find. It wasn't easy to eliminate all those shadows. I had a lot of sleepless nights trialing different arrangements, but eventually I got one as close to perfect as I could. I figured if I could just have 1 or 2 nights of sleep, it'd be damn easier to deal with. An hour passed before my stomach began to ache. By the time I realized what Grenwick was doing, I could already feel the urge to throw up.
Oh, no.
Guess I hadn't given him much of a choice. He wanted to play, and there was only one place in that room that was still dark.
Oh my god.
It wasn't until I threw myself out into the living room and switched off all the lights that the pain eased up. By then, I was already close to suffocating on the finger sticking out to my throat. When it finally withdrew and I took my first breath in over a minute, I collapsed to the floor, unable to do much of anything except to heave and sob. Grenwick, yellow eyes glaring at me from the space between my sofa, giggled. In hindsight, I'm lucky he found it funny. I think he thought it was a game of sorts. God knows what would have happened if that little stunt had made him mad. Otherwise, that second round passed without incident. At least I wasn't at work. It was hell, but I didn't have to worry about driving anywhere or being out in public waiting for those wretched hands to find me. I just stayed indoors and played his weird little games, which mainly just involved me cleaning up whatever stupid thing he decided to make a mess of. I found it helped if I played up my exasperation. The less I reacted to his mischief, the more likely he'd escalate. When it was all over, I asked for a winning lottery ticket. Unfortunately, I didn't specify the amount, which I suppose is my fault. At least the amount I won covered rent that month, even if my expectations were a little higher. Still, I figured it'd be better next time. I'd be more specific, I decided. Best laid plans of mice and men. You ever lost someone? Most people have. I have for sure. More than once too. It nearly unmade me, and I was a fully grown man. It was about a couple days before my turn that Alia experienced the first loss. Most kids, it's a hamster. If they're unlucky, a grandparent. For her, it was her older brother. I taught him 11 years earlier, and he was a good kid. Smart like her. Went on to become a mechanic. His passing wasn't anything strange or sinister. Just an accident. Jack popped off. Car crushed him. Random. Devastating. She was called out of a lesson by the principal and her parents. The 3 of them looking like hell. Like they'd spent a month one-on-one with Grenwick. A little reminder that not all nightmares hide in the dark, I suppose. I don't know why this hit me hard. I think it was probably my own experience with grief. Either way, it stuck with me. Her absence, the empty chair and desk, felt hard to ignore day after day, knowing what she was going through. I think it's one thing to accept that these kids will face circumstance, poverty, bad parents, life isn't fair. I don't get a say in the way society says some kids get ponies and others get rickets. But there's something about losing someone that way. Just a random confluence of bad luck that hits harder than most. I don't know if I can explain it. It's just Alia was already grown up at the bottom rung of our not very invisible class system. Hadn't she had a fair share of bad luck already? I mean, damn, even Grenwick grants favors. Even that wretched monster isn't all bad. But an accident like what happened to Alia's brother, there's no upside. It's just a mess. Thing is, like I said, my turn was coming up. And I mean, the way I saw it, the boy was already dead, right? It wasn't like he could die getting wrapped up 3 times around a lathe. Was that already come to pass? I decided to do something that even at the time, I figured to be pretty stupid. But if there was a chance it could work, well,
Oh no.
I had to try. Round 3 at the Grenwick went real easy. I preemptively bought a bunch of jigsaws and left them half done. He honed in on them straight away. I did as much as I could in a single sitting, turned around, turned back, and he'd muddled them all up. I'd play up my anger and irritation, then go back to it. Drank a lot of coffee and whiskey, watched a lot of movies. Grenwick loved it. Broke a couple plates and mugs too. It wasn't all plain sailing. Woke up one night to find him licking my neck and had to rush to the hospital to get the chemical burn treated. Still, for the most part, the week went by without much incident because, well, I had something in mind. Couldn't get it out. This idea, I had to act on it. And the promise of what it would mean if it worked meant I practically skated to the week with a smile on my face. At least I had the sense to specify the boy returned to me, not Alia. I thought if anything went wrong, it'd be best if she didn't have to see it. It was 4 in the morning when I was awoken by a sound that had slipped into my dreams as a kind of creaking door. But as I opened my eyes and reality reasserted itself, I realized that what I was actually hearing was a little more gravel being trod on. Strange, distant, quiet. I held my breath, if only so that I could hear better. But it seemed to only amp up the sound of blood rushing through my ears. White noise. It's so hard to perceive what's there sometimes, isn't it? All I wanted was for my ears or eyes to report something useful to me without having to get out of the safety of my own bed. Instead, all I got were dim shadows and the sea-like susurrations of my own breathing. At least I could ascertain I wasn't alone in my apartment. Over time, the longer I waited, the more sure of that I became. Something was out there, in the corridor between my bedroom and the living room, I'd guess, moving with a kind of irregular rhythm that belongs only to living things. This wasn't the wind or some pipe settling. Something was moving, and it was moving in my direction. Low to the ground, a noise I couldn't put any shape to. Wrong, all wrong. Made me think of breaking pencils, grinding teeth. In the end, I couldn't help myself. I got up and called out, "Who's there?" The words didn't feel real to me. The world took on a realer than real distortion that comes with terror, coupled with a prickling white heat at the nape of the neck. For a moment, I swore I was outside my own body, staring down at myself from above. It was too much. But that sound was clearer than ever before. There was no pretending. This ghost wasn't real. I turned on the light. Alia's brother screamed and crawled away from the light. Neglected whimpers left behind like a trail that led me to the living room, where I found him curled around a table leg. He was alive, but not whole. Guess I hadn't given much thought to what a car would do to a man's chest. Every breath was a strange orchestra. Too many sounds to disentangle. Bone on bone, crumbled ribs expanding, or at least trying to, and drawing oxygen into blood-filled lungs. Moss had grown across his face, even in the short time he'd been in the ground. A hand, ice cold, shot out and grabbed my wrist and cried out, but he didn't let go. He followed as I tried to push myself away, his bottom half trailing along, limp and misaligned with his torso. Felt like pulling a sack of meat across an ice rink. "Don't send me back," he whimpered. "Don't send me back." Eventually, my foot hit the sofa and I fell into it. He dragged himself, using his hands over to the side so that we were face to face before I even had time to push myself upright. "He likes you," he whispered, and I recoiled at the smell of his breath. "There are so few things in the dark that know how to leave, but he does. Don't ask him to send me back, please." For the first time, my mind started working. Was he talking about Grenwig, I wondered. But of course, I told myself. Who else? What's over there? I asked. He went to answer before the words choked in his mouth and his face twisted into a mask of melancholic agony. Trying to utter something, he burst into painful sobs. "Don't make me go back," was all he could manage to say. "Don't make me go back. Don't make me go back. Please, please don't send me back there. You don't know what they do to us." I don't know what to do," I stammered. The boy grabbed me and pulled me close, unsure of how to comfort him. I let him hold me in an embrace. "We aren't the same when it's done with us." "What?" I never saw him take the knife from the kitchen, but I suppose he'd been in my home for longer than I'd been awake, and he had plenty of opportunity. First thing I felt, which surprised me even in the moment, was that it suddenly became hard to breathe. That was the punctured lung. Felt like the worst pneumonia I'd ever had come over me in the space of 5 seconds. Just boom, suffocating in your own blood, so much that it spilled over my lips and down my chin. By the time I registered the aching waves of dull agony pulsing out of the spot on my ribcage, I was already slumping back down onto the sofa, sitting there like I was getting ready for a Friday night move. Not that I was helpless. I took maybe 2 seconds, tops, to accept what had happened, to understand it, and then was able to drive my heel into his head as he tried to climb up onto me. Weirdly, his broken back helped him. He sort of just bent the blow, but it didn't actually dislodge him. I had to kick him again to do that, and then I had to stand up and do it again and again. And I think around the 4th or 5th kick, I realized I had something of a problem. The pain didn't really bother him. Not when I kicked him in his pulled chest, not when I stamped on his hand as he tried to push himself back up for the 10th time, not even when I rolled him over and stamped on his head, struggling to aim my foot through the tears in my eyes, even as I immobilized him, even as I fumbled around and found an old bike helmet and clubbed his skull into my arm for a sore. He didn't cry out in pain. He just kept trying to get back up. Damn, I screamed as seconds turned to minutes. It's just getting on. I felt like I was swimming for hours. But in truth, I don't know how long. Eventually, it stopped for breath. I was feeling faint, and my whole right side was burning hot and cold, all at once as warm blood began to pool. Oh God, I cried, just take him back. Grinwig's hands wasted little time, and that man's laughter grew only more hysterical as the fingers wrapped around his chest and legs and slowly towed him towards the dark. I felt a brief moment of relief as I hoped this would be the end of my mistake. But then, I felt his arms wrap around my legs. Even broken, his strength was something special. Trapped in a bear hug, slowly being pulled toward that abyssal shadow, I began to panic. But it was far too little and far too late. I went feet first, a feeling like nothing else I'd ever had. In the end, I was clinging by the tips of my fingers to an impossible ledge. Above me was a sort of opening with no defined beginning or end. And on the other side laid my living room. I looked down, and for the first time saw Grenwig as a whole. In hindsight, it had been a mistake to think of him as humanoid. I think I just decided the boogeyman should look like a man. But what floated in the strange ether beneath me was more akin to a jellyfish, or maybe a spider. I don't know. It was dark in that void, and yet impossibly clear. I could see things in there, more than just Grenwig. It defied dimensions as we understand it. It was both an ocean and a landscape. In the distance, violence ran through open space. I'm not even sure I was seeing based on light. When I blinked, I still saw everything. Grenwig know, it would be wild. But I had no idea of the details until she began to speak in a soft, hoarse voice. She said she'd been halfway through the park, walking at a fast pace, because she planned on taking a shower and then heading back out to meet some friends and was running behind. When she realized an older man was walking next to her. Well, not next to her, she said. About 50 feet away, traveling across the grass, stepping over hedges and sidewalks without slowing or even looking at where he was going.
Dog hype?
Instead, he was just keeping pace with her, step for step, and staring at her with a wide smile that made him look like a skull between his pale skin and his bald head. This freaked her out, of course, and she began walking faster. She didn't run, she said, because she felt like it was kind of like running from a bear. You shouldn't show weakness or fear, but just get away before things went from weird to bad. So, she turned to look to where she was going and to see if she saw any people closer than her apartment complex a block away. There was none, and when she looked back to where the man had been, he was gone. That's when she felt the hand plunging into her long, blonde hair and pulling her to the ground. I'd known it was going to be something about her hair. Her injuries, other than a bruise on her throat and a couple of other scrapes, were all on her head. Dozens of oozing places where the strange bald man had held her down and roughly cut off all her hair with a straight razor. Crying softly, she showed me a picture of her the week before. Long, curly hair the color of summer honey framed her then smiling face. A past her that didn't know what was about to happen. The version of her before me looked 10 years older and broken in some fundamental way. Sniffing back tears, she said that when the man yanked her to the ground, the breath went out of her, but she immediately started trying to get up and get away. That he had grabbed her by the throat and held her back down, but just for a moment, just long enough that he could spit in her face. Hattie said it made no sense, but after he did that, she couldn't move anymore, not at all. The girl told me the doctors had tried to say it was shock or fear, but she said that was nonsense. She was paralyzed by the thick, foul-smelling wad he'd spat onto her face, and even him producing the straight razor from a hidden pocket didn't get her moving again beyond the hammering of her heart. He never said anything, just smiled as he began gripping handfuls of her hair and scraping them off her scalp. I asked her if it hurt, and she gave me a watery laugh. She said that sure, it did, but that wasn't the worst part. He was feeling so violated and having a part of her taken away. Even more than the fear of what he might do to her after, the feeling had been the worst. When he had rolled her over to her stomach to cut the rest of her hair off, she felt the first tingles of movement starting to come back. Not enough to really move, but some small stirring twitches. She decided to wait, let it come back more, and then try to run when the opportunity came, or he was distracted. Not that she was just sitting and waiting for him to do whatever he wanted. Every moment she was tensed to try and fight if she saw the blade coming for her neck, or if he tried to take her clothes off. She just knew that she couldn't really move or fight yet, and she wanted him to either go slow or just stop and leave her alone. He chose the latter. When he had cut off the last of her hair, he scooped up the pile next to her head and walked a few feet away, out of her line of sight. She heard some kind of gasping, choking sound then, and while it took all the strength, she managed to turn her head slightly to see what he was doing. He was eating her hair. She said it scared her worse than before, though she couldn't have said why.
She ate her hair.
And it was then, as she lay frozen and horrified, that the man suddenly let out a gasping groan and toppled over onto the grass. He lay there, twitching for what felt like a minute or two, and though from her angle she couldn't see his face, she felt like he was either having a seizure or choking to death. She hoped for the latter, but didn't dare rely on that. Forcing her limbs to move, she got to her hands and knees and started to crawl out to the street. Everything felt weird and slow, but she started making progress, periodically looking back to see if the man was still out. First time, still down and twitching. Second time, he was sitting up and staring at her. It was at this point that she started shaking and crying harder. So, after waiting a couple of minutes, I asked a question to prompt her. Did he come for her again? No, she said. They looked at each other. He gave her another smile, and she started crawling faster while screaming her head off. A guy was jogging down the other side of the street and came over to help. When she looked back the next time, her attacker was gone. Thank God, I said, and she nodded in mute agreement. But I could tell there was something more. When I asked, she paused a long time before shaking her head. You'll just think I'm a crazy liar like they do. I had to reassure her that I wouldn't think any such thing several times before she finally told me the rest. When he sat up, when I saw him that last time, he wasn't bald anymore. He had long, curly hair, blonde hair, just like mine. He ate my hair and stole it from me. Over the next couple of months, I checked on her case. Hattie had moved back to Wisconsin to be with her family, and while her physical wounds were healing well enough, she still had emotional issues she was working through from the attack. When I called her mental health counselor at a new college, she tried to talk very broadly and not give me any details. But toward the end of the conversation, she did let one slip. The poor dear. It's so strange how her hair won't grow back. It was another month and a half before I saw the graffiti. I normally took a bus home to just 2 blocks from my work, but one day my normal bus line was delayed due to an accident, so I had the choice of paying for a taxi or walking further to a different stop. I picked the latter, and while the neighborhood I traveled through didn't seem especially rough or dangerous, it was more run down than the places I worked or lived. More closed businesses and unkempt plots, and graffiti scattered along the walls here and there. It was when I was nearing the bus stop that I had to walk under an overpass bridge that had colourful drawings and sayings, insults and boasts. Yet, among that riot of lines and squiggles, one thing stood apart, as though none of the rest wanted to be close to this single line written in simple letters of dark red. He only eats the best of us. A year earlier, I would have laughed at the line, wondering if it was a social commentary or a line from a movie. But, walking through that patch of shadows as the words burned down at me from above, my mind immediately went to Hattie, and I walked faster until I reached my stop. When I reached it, I looked back, and that's when I saw him. A thin, pale man with long, flowing, blonde hair. I might have let out a little scream right then. I don't remember. I do recall turning back to the street, thinking I needed to call a taxi or get someone's attention. When I saw the bus turning the corner a block down, and I nearly cried in relief. Running to meet it, I jumped on as soon as the doors opened, and when I looked back, I saw no sign of the man anywhere. Heart pounding, I scanned my pass and took a seat in the middle of the bus. It was only half full, but the comfort of being around other people, even total strangers, was undeniable. I felt like a gazelle, hiding in the herd from a stalking lion. The dramatic flair of the thought made me laugh. Wasn't I overreacting? Had I really seen the man, or had I just imagined it because I was tired and taking a strange route that made me uneasy? Glancing at my phone, I guessed my nearest stop to home would be about 20 minutes away. After a moment's debate, I set my phone alarm for 15 in case I dozed off. Though that seemed unlikely given the panic I'd felt a few moments before. I might not ever sleep. I woke up to words being spoken right next to my ear. You have lovely eyes.
Oh god.
I jumped in my seat and started to turn around when I froze. The evening had fully come on by now, and the windows of the bus were all black with the growing night outside. In the reflection of the window closest to me, I could not only see myself, but who had spoken to me. It was the old, blonde man, leaning against my ear like a whispering lover. In the reflection, my terrified gaze found his milky eyes, hanging like infected moons above his sickly, sickle smile. He held me with that look for a moment, before rasping out the words again. You have lovely eyes. My fear broke the spell this time, and I jumped out of my seat and rushed to the front, yelling for the driver to let me out. Let me out now, goddammit. Looking surprised and irritated, he pulled to the curb, even as my phone alarm went off. I was just 2 blocks away now, and I wasn't above running the entire way. So that's exactly what I did. I jumped off the bus as the doors opened, pulling off my heels and running barefoot down the sidewalk for 2 blocks to my building. I never looked back the entire time, and it wasn't until I was behind my door and the deadbolt was thrown that I took a breath and dared to look back out through the peephole. I saw no sign of anyone out there, and when I went to my windows to look for any sign of the old man following me, I found none. Good. It was maybe a coincidence, but even if it was Hattie's guy, he couldn't have followed me all the way home, not with how fast I was. There was a knock at the door. Stifling another scream, I crept back to the door, not wanting to betray that I was home. Looking back through the peephole, I saw nothing. Maybe it had been a mistake, and the person had realized they had the wrong door and went on. I waited for a couple of minutes, watching and listening for someone, and there was nothing. It wasn't until I turned to go into the living room that a new knock returned. This one more rhythmic and familiar. Knock, 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 knock. I gave a shudder as I realized I recognized what that was.
Everyone knocks that knock.
Shave and a haircut, 2 bits. Biting my lip, I went back to the door and stared out again through the hole. There was still no one out there that I could see. Not that I was about to open the door to fully check. What if they were just standing to the side, waiting for me to crack the door? I debated calling the police, but I wasn't sure what to tell them, or if they'd even come for something so small. So instead, I called the building's handyman, George. Told him I thought a creepy guy might have followed me into the building, and now someone kept knocking on my door. I asked him did he mind coming up and just see if he saw anything. He sounded sleepy and irritated initially, but when he heard the fear in my voice, he said he'd be right there. Less than 5 minutes later, there was a new knock on the door. But this time, it was quickly followed by George's voice. Miss Castillo, there's no one out here now. I'm going to double check the other doors, but I think you're okay. Someone did leave you something out here though. I unlocked the door and opened it partway. Left something? What? George pushed the item through the crack and handed it to me. There. That's for you, I guess. I think you're okay. But you be careful, okay? There are some bad things out there. I noticed that he said things instead of people, but I let it pass. George, is something wrong? He looked a little paler as he forced a smile and shook his head, never raising his eyes to me. No, I think everything is okay. Just keep your door locked, okay? And let me know if you have any more trouble. I gotta get back downstairs. I thought about reminding him to check the other floors, but then he was gone. Shutting the door back and locking it, I decided it didn't matter. I had a feeling he wasn't going anywhere except down to his own apartment to turn his own deadbolt. That feeling only grew when I turned on the lights and looked more closely at what had been left for me. Maybe it had been a mocking threat or a warning, but I knew what it felt like. A promise. So, the next day I gave my notice and moved most of my stuff into an extended stay hotel. 3 weeks later, I was driving a moving truck across the country to my new home. The first thing I set out in my new house was the gift I got that night. I hate looking at it, but I need to see it, be reminded of it, like a head or heart full of scars, or the red letters scrawled underneath a bridge. It warns me to never let my guard down, to never assume that the darkness has nothing but empty fear waiting for me in its depths. Even now, I can see it on my mantle, gleaming a dull grey. I think it's made of pewter, and it feels very heavy and old the few times I've been able to make myself touch it. Not that I need to anymore. I still see it when I close my eyes. A thick-handled metal spoon with a deep, round bowl that tapers to a sharp edge on the outer rim. Not by initial design, but by use of whetstone or a grinder. It's more of a razor now, hard and cold and bitingly thin, shaped for cutting and digging. And I know, without checking, that if someone were to stick it into my eye socket, they could slice through the lid and scoop out my eyeball like a bit of overripe melon. My hands are shaking as I tell you this. I can't quite look at the mantle any longer, so I look out the window instead. It's not dark yet, but the shadows are growing fatter with each passing morsel of the day. I force myself to keep looking into the deepening twilight, and some nights I even tell myself I'm not still afraid. But the whisper in my heart isn't of bravery or strength. It's the dreadful double thrum of the gazelle's heart looking out into the darkness. Not looking out of courage, but out of terror and necessity and weak, trembling hope. Hope that when we look out into the darkness, nothing looks back. was drawing near. A few years ago, I was invited to a dinner party. It wasn't that fancy, just a few old friends reconnecting. People I hadn't seen since high school. Some of the people on that list were people I hadn't seen or heard of for years, so it'd be a nice opportunity to catch up. My wife couldn't come though, invites only. She didn't mind. I looked forward to it all week. I took out my old Tom Skog high school baseball cap and went through the guest list. There were a few names I recognized at the drop of a hat, and a few that I didn't. I figured some people had changed their names over the years. While it wasn't a proper reunion, more like a get-together of old friends, I still got the sense that there was something more to it. There was no anniversary coming up, so it sort of came out of nowhere. I got the impression that maybe something else was up, like a proposal or some other announcement. The big night took place on a Saturday at a rented venture just outside of town, some old clubhouse. Nothing big or fancy, but enough to house the 8 partygoers that had pressed the I will attend button. I got there a bit early, dressed up in my favorite jacket, sporting the classic baseball cap. It smelled a bit like mildew, but what the hell. If there ever was a time to wear it, this was it. Rolling up to the house, the first person I ran into was the host herself. Jerry, short for Geraldine. She was the de facto head of the AV club back in high school. The elected president of the club was often missing or off doing their own thing, leaving Jerry to take care of the practicalities. If there was one person I'd bet on to arrange a night like this, it'd be her. She swept me up in a big hug, pulling a little on my baseball cap. "Oh, we're bringing out the big guns, huh?" She laughed. "Should have kept my club sweater. Gotta represent the Togs." The stupid name we used for the locals. It was still around. Over time, the others dropped in. Nellie, the overachiever. Ollie, or Ole, who was on the student council. Chris and Corey, the twins. Omar, who didn't move in until the final year, but instantly made himself part of the group. Finally, we just waited for Tess. It was getting late, so we figured she could catch up later. We had a couple of drinks and got snacking on some appetizers. Jerry had arranged for a catered meal. It didn't take long for us to fall back into our old roles, finding our way back to each other like we'd never left. There is a saying that the better you know someone, the less you need to talk to them. It really is true. It was just a matter of minutes before we were right back to where we left things all those years ago. But Tess was a no-show. I figured she'd run into some sort of last-minute issue, but Jerry wasn't convinced. If anything, Jerry was being a bit strange about it, avoidant. Halfway through the main course, Nellie checked her phone. She fell silent all of a sudden. It was hard to tell, since everyone else was laughing and chatting about, but I saw her lift her hand to her mouth, and her eyes stopped blinking. She'd seen something shocking. I gently elbowed Omar next to me, who noticed the same thing. Once the two of us quieted down, so did the others. It didn't take long for the entire table to notice. Nellie looked up at us. There's been an accident. I think Tess is not... She sniffled, putting down her phone. She buried her face in her hands, trying her best to hold back the tears. Everyone picked up their phones, trying to see if what she'd said was true. checking local news, social media, anything. But I kept my eyes on Jerry. She was unnaturally quiet about this. It didn't take long for the room to devolve. Nellie was openly weeping. Olay just went pale, staring into the wall. Chris and Corey started arguing about the details as they differed from one source to the next. Omar just shook his head over and over, trying to convince himself it wasn't true. But of course, it was. Turns out Tess had some kind of aneurysm earlier that day. Out like a light the moment she sat down in a car. Completely unavoidable and undetectable. It just took some time for people to notice, since it looked like someone just sitting in their car. But Jerry just sat there, sipping a wine. She didn't look at her phone, and she didn't join the conversation. There was a shake to her hand, like she was suddenly nervous. I wanted to pull her aside and ask her about it, but there was no space. People were talking over one another, calling out, demanding my attention. All the while, Jerry didn't move a muscle. Then, the power went out. It went completely dark. For a moment, all I could see were faces lit up by smartphone screens like ghastly apparitions. I joined in, and so did Jerry. The discussion just died as we all looked at one another. At some point, someone turned their phone towards the table, as if looking for something. As the light panned across the room, we all noticed, in unison, a shape. It was only there for a fraction of a second. Something tall, dark and spectral. Arms that reached all the way to the floor. Something sickly thin and black as oil. There was a shrill screech, like the cables inside the walls were burning, screaming for help. This high-pitched burn, something overloading, bathing the room in the smell of burnt plastic and gypsum. In the blink of an eye, the power returned, and with it, the dark disappeared. The room erupted. Nellie was on her feet, backing away from the table. Ollie crouched down. The twins just stood up, looking lost. Omar just froze, not knowing what to do. But my eyes landed on Jerry and what she was doing. She just sat there, staring at the space where the dark thing had stood. As the room fell silent, I caught her attention. "What's going on?" I wheezed. What was that?" Jerry shook her head. As the rest of the room turned their attention to her, she began stuttering. Her eyes shifted from one to the next, until she finally gave in. It's hard to explain." So now, we got the real story. It started a couple of months ago. It started with a woman named Gwen. She had been an acquaintance at best, someone that most of the group hadn't interacted much with. She was part of another clique, in a way, and there wasn't much crossover between the groups. She had suddenly passed, leaving some former classmates devastated. Tess had heard about it somewhere in a social peripheral. One post in particular had stood out. In one of the memorial comment sections, someone mentioned she knew this was coming. She'd seen the spectre of death, she told me, and I think she was at peace. After that, there'd been 2 more deaths, a man and a woman, both dropping dead within a month of one another. Again, vague hints to seeing something and a spectre. But this time, Tess knew them a little better. In fact, she talked to one of them just weeks ahead of their death. things became apparent. One, that they were being followed by something. And two, that they knew their time was running short. By that third death, Tess figured it was no longer a coincidence. Their old friends were dropping like flies. She reached out to Jerry to kind of get the gang together to talk about it. But only days ahead of the reunion, she'd started to see the Spectre herself. She wanted us to go ahead, with or without her, said Jerry. She knew this would happen. So, what does it mean? Nellie asked. We all saw it. Are we all next? Jerry shook her head as the questions rained. What the hell is that? Yelled Corey. Were you going to tell us? Chris joined in. Question after question after question. Finally, Jerry just slumped into a chair, still shaking her head. I don't know, she repeated over and over. I just don't know. Ollie was the first to react. He headed for the door. I'm getting the hell out of here, he yelled. Screw this. The moment he opened the door, the power was cut again. My phone was glowing hot in my hand, overloaded by static electricity. All the illuminated faces flickered as our phones struggled to stay alive. In a vague flicker from one of our phone screens, I only caught a glimpse of it. A figure so tall, we couldn't see the head as it loomed outside the door.
Alright, guys.
An impossibly long arm reached in.
I'm getting tired.
Ollie just screamed,
We'll have to continue
evolving into a
another
series
day.
of ever-repeating no-no-nos.
So
Until
please like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, what do we say? We say nothing.